dissolving into a violent storm of splinters and rusted hinges. The door practically vanished from its frame. An immediate flashbang sucked the air from the room, leaving behind blinding white noise and the sharp, chemical reek of burnt sulfur. Once the drywall dust eventually settled, 5 red laser sights converged on the chest of an old man who sat calmly at a pine table, wiping spilled coffee from his chin. Alfred had known they were coming since Tuesday. You don't make a phone call to a dead-end Pentagon extension from a burner trace phone and expect the mailman to show up. You expect the dogs. But anticipating violence and living through its opening note are 2 entirely different things. 20 minutes before the world exploded, the cabin was quiet. Just the low, asthmatic wheeze of the wood stove in the corner and the rhythmic ticking of a battery-operated wall clock shaped like a trout. Alfred sat at the center of the room. His hands were wrapped around a ceramic mug that chipped on the rim a decade ago. The coffee was lukewarm, tasting faintly of aluminum and old grounds, but he drank it anyway. It gave his hands something to do. The tremor in his left ring finger had been getting worse lately, a cruel little metronome ticking out his declining neurology. He wore a faded flannel shirt that smelled of wood smoke and a lingering, sour hint of unwashed laundry. At 71, he had stopped pretending to care about the state of his collar. His joints felt like crushed glass. Every movement, a negotiation with pain. He shifted his weight on the wooden chair, his right hip screaming in dull protest, and looked at the center of the table. There it sat, a manila folder. It wasn't glowing. It didn't look dangerous. It was just cardboard, softened at the corners by the oils of human hands, slightly warped from humidity. Across the front, stamped in a red ink that had faded to the color of dried blood, were the words, "Top Secret, No Foreign." Alfred reached out, his calloused fingertips brushing the rough texture of the paper. It felt terrifyingly mundane. 40 years of running, of waking up in cold sweats, of looking over his shoulder in grocery store parking lots, all distilled into a 1/4-inch stack of typewritten pages. Outside, the woods went dead. It was a subtle shift. The scrub jays that had been fighting over a stale piece of bread on the porch railing abruptly vanished. The wind rustling the Douglas firs seemed to hold its breath. Alfred paused, the mug halfway to his mouth. He knew that silence. He had heard it in the jungles of a country he tried not to dream about, and he had heard it in the concrete valleys of Berlin. It was the vacuum that preceded the storm. Crunch. A singular, heavy boot breaking a twig coated in morning frost. It was careless, some rookie on the perimeter, over-adrenalized, shifting his weight. Alfred's heart, an old, tired muscle, betrayed his calm facade. It gave a hard, painful thud against his ribs. He realized his mouth was suddenly dry as chalk. He didn't want to die here. Not really. He had spent years telling himself he was ready for the end, that he welcomed the finality of it. But sitting here, smelling the impending violence, a pathetic animal instinct clawed at his throat, begging him to run, to hide under the bed, to surrender. He forced himself to take a breath. It rattled in his chest. Just stay in the chair, he told himself. Don't give them a reason to twitch. He didn't even hear the footsteps on the porch. Modern tactical gear was terrifyingly quiet. The front door, a heavy slab of solid oak that had kept out blizzards and black bears for 30 years, ceased to exist. The breech charge ripped through the wood with a concussive shockwave that punched the breath straight out of Alfred's lungs. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical blow to the face. The shockwave knocked the coffee mug from his hands. It shattered on the floor, brown liquid splashing across his worn boots. Then came the flashbang. Alfred had squeezed his eyes shut, but it didn't matter. The brilliant white light penetrated his eyelids, searing into his retinas. The noise was a physical entity, a deafening shriek that instantly ruptured the fragile silence of the cabin and left a high-pitched, agonizing whine in his ears. He gasped, choking on the sudden cloud of pulverized drywall, atomized wood, and the acrid, metallic stink of explosives. He flinched. He couldn't help it. His shoulders curled inward, his chin tucking to his chest as he coughed violently, a wet, tearing sound. A small line of saliva and coffee slipped down his chin. He felt a warm, humiliating dampness in his groin as his bladder briefly betrayed him in the shock of the blast. He wasn't a stone-cold badass. He was a frightened, arthritic old man sitting in a cloud of dust. Hands. Show me your fucking hands. The voices were disembodied, distorted by the ringing in Alfred's ears and the heavy respirators of the men flooding the room. They swarmed in like angry, heavily armored wasps. Black Kevlar, ballistic helmets, the harsh, blinding glare of weapon-mounted flashlights cutting through the smoke. Get down, on the floor. Do it now. Alfred blinked, his eyes watering profusely from the chemical smoke. He could barely see. 5 red laser dots danced frantically across his chest, his stomach, his face. He felt the phantom pressure of them, as if they were already burning holes through his flannel shirt. He didn't get down. He couldn't. If he got on the floor, he wasn't entirely sure he'd ever be able to get back up. Instead, he took a slow, agonizingly deliberate breath, tasting dust and burnt ozone. Slowly, fighting the tremor that was now shaking his entire arm, he lifted his hands. Not high into the air, his rotator cuffs had given out years ago, but just enough to rest his palms flat on either side of the manila folder. "I'm right here," Alfred rasped. His voice cracked, a dry, unused sound. He cleared his throat and tried again, speaking to the blinding flashlights. "I'm not going anywhere." The kinetic energy in the room was overwhelming, a coiled spring ready to snap. The SWAT team had breached expecting a heavily fortified sovereign citizen, a domestic terror cell, or a cartel offshoot. That was what the no-knock warrant, signed in the dead of night by a federal judge, had demanded. The intel had promised a compound. Instead, they were pointing assault rifles at a geriatric, holding up his hands like he was surrendering to a nursing home orderly. Target secured. Center room. Non-compliant, seated. One of the operators barked into his shoulder mic, his voice tight. The adrenaline had nowhere to go. They kept their weapons trained on him, the lasers steadying now, burning bright red against the faded blue plaid of Alfred's chest. A heavy silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the crunch of glass under tactical boots and the heavy, ragged breathing of the men in black. The smoke was slowly drifting out through the shattered doorway, letting the cold morning air bleed in. A figure pushed through the stack of men. He was taller, broader, his helmet marked with a white stripe. The team leader. He kept his rifle raised, but slightly lowered off-center, his eyes scanning the room, searching for the ambush, the tripwires, the invisible threat. He found nothing, just a dying fire, a sink full of dirty dishes, and a wall of worn paperback books. The leader took 2 slow steps forward. Alfred could hear the subtle squeak of the man's body armor rubbing against his webbing. He could smell the sour, nervous sweat radiating off the cop, mixing with the sharp scent of gun oil. "Sir, I need you to stand up and turn around," the leader commanded. His voice was muffled behind the visor, but Alfred could hear the confusion bleeding through the authoritative tone. The guy was young, maybe early 30s, too young to know what the Cold War felt like, too young to understand what was sitting on the table. "Son," Alfred said, the coughing fit subsiding into a dull ache in his chest. If I stand up right now, I'm going to fall over. My knees are bone on bone, and you boys just scared half a year off my life. I'm unarmed. The leader paused. He glanced at the operator to his left, giving a sharp nod. Two men broke from the formation, rushing forward. They didn't hit Alfred, but they weren't gentle. Heavy, gloved hands seized his wrists, pulling his arms back behind the chair. It hurt. Alfred bit the inside of his cheek, tasting iron, refusing to groan as they patted him down with rough, aggressive strokes, checking his waistband, his ankles, beneath his collar. Clear, one of them grunted, stepping back. The leader finally lowered his rifle, letting it hang on its tactical sling. He reached up and pushed his visor back. His face was flushed, a bead of sweat tracking down the side of his temple. His name tape-read Carter. He looked at Alfred, his brow furrowed in deep irritation and bewilderment. "You Alfred Hayes?" Carter asked, his breathing slowing. "Mostly," Alfred replied, shifting his shoulders to ease the stinging in his joints. "What's left of him, anyway?" Carter looked around the dilapidated cabin again, as if hoping the real heavily armed terrorist was hiding behind the refrigerator. "We have a federal warrant for this property. Intel said this was a fortified position." Alfred let out a sound that was half laugh, half wheeze. "Intel is an oxymoron, Captain. Always has been. The only thing fortified here is my cholesterol." Carter didn't smile. He stepped closer to the table. He looked down at the spilled coffee, the shattered mug, and then his eyes locked onto the center of the wood. The folder, the bold red letters, top, secret, no foreign. Alfred watched Carter's posture change. The tactical aggression drained away, replaced by a sudden, rigid wariness. It was the body language of a man who had just realized he stepped off the marked path and into a minefield. SWAT dealt in meth labs, hostages, and barricaded gunmen. They didn't deal in classified federal documents sitting in the open in the middle of the Montana wilderness. "What is that?" Carter asked. His voice was quieter now, the booming command replaced by genuine caution. Alfred didn't look at the file. He kept his tired, bloodshot eyes fixed on Carter. He noticed the slight twitch in the young man's jaw. "That," Alfred said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur, "is the reason you were sent here, to blow my door off its hinges instead of just knocking." Carter stared at the folder. He didn't reach for it. He knew better. You don't touch something stamped with that level of clearance unless you want the men in cheap suits crawling all over your life for the next 10 years. "Who are you?" Carter asked, looking back up at Alfred. The lasers from the other men had dropped from Alfred's chest to the floor. The kinetic threat was gone. Now, it was just a strange, heavy puzzle. "I'm a ghost, Carter," Alfred said softly. "I was a ghost before you were born. And for the last 3 days, I've been waiting for someone to come put me in a box." Alfred slowly moved his right hand. The operators in the back tensed, rifles twitching upward, but Carter held up a flat palm, stopping them. Alfred's arthritic fingers rested on the edge of the manila folder. The cardboard felt cold. "I made a call," Alfred continued, his voice steadying, finding a rhythm he hadn't used in decades. "I told them I had it. I told them I was tired of carrying it. I expected some quiet men in an unmarked sedan, not the cavalry." He looked at the shattered doorway, the cold wind blowing the dust in swirling eddies. "They must be terrified if they sent a kinetic entry team. They wanted you to shoot me in the confusion, didn't they?" Carter frowned, his jaw tightening. "We don't do assassinations, old man. We execute warrants." You execute what you're pointed at, Alfred corrected gently, without malice, just like I did. But you didn't shoot. And now, we have a problem. We don't have a problem, Carter said, stepping up to the table, his physical size dominating the space. You're under arrest. The feds will be here in 20 minutes to tear this place apart. That file goes in an evidence bag. Alfred shook his head slowly. If that file goes in an evidence bag, Carter, the men coming behind you will put a bullet in the back of your head and the heads of every man in this room, just to make sure none of you read it. The room went dead silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. One of the men in the back shifted uncomfortably, the squeak of rubber soles loud in the quiet cabin. Carter leaned in, placing his heavy, gloved hands on the table, bringing his face inches from Alfred's. Alfred could smell the wintergreen gum the cop was chewing. "I don't play games, Hayes," Carter whispered. "What is in the folder?" Alfred looked down at the faded red stamp. He felt the weight of 40 years pressing down on the back of his neck. He thought of the faces in the dark, the smell of aviation fuel, the lies told to widows in neat suburban living rooms. "It's the receipt," Alfred said, his voice cracking, betraying a sudden, profound exhaustion. "For the things we bought in the dark, so you could sleep in the light. And the bill is finally due." Alfred slid his finger under the flap of the envelope and casually flipped it open. The manila folder fell open with the dry, scraping sound of dead skin. Carter instinctively flinched, pulling his chin back a fraction of an inch. It was a microscopic movement, the involuntary recoil of a man expecting a snake to strike. But there was no trap, just paper. A stark, fluorescent white ledger sheet sat on top, violently contrasting with the yellowed cardboard. It smelled of breaking down lignin, that faint vanilla and dust odor of an old library, undercut by the sharp chemical tang of the C4 charge, still hanging heavily in the room. Alfred didn't touch the documents. He just rested his gnarled hands on the table on either side of the open file, the tremor in his left ring finger tapping a quiet, erratic rhythm against the pine. Carter's eyes dropped to the page. He didn't want to look. Every protocol hammered into his head at Quantico, and the State Academy screamed at him to secure the suspect, bag the evidence unread, and clear the zone. But human curiosity is a fatal flaw, and the red stamp at the top of the page was a gravitational pull. It wasn't a list of sleeper agents or nuclear launch codes. It was a logistical manifest. Columns of numbers, dates stretching back to the late 80s, flight tail numbers, and names. Carter's gaze caught on a cluster of names near the bottom. He recognized two. One was a sitting senator who had built his entire career on being a moral crusader. The other was a defense contractor whose face was currently plastered across the covers of financial magazines. Next to their names were bank routing numbers from the Cayman Islands and coordinates that looked like they belonged somewhere in the Horn of Africa. Beside that, a tally of units processed. The word processed sat there on the page, cold and sterile. "What is this?" Carter asked. The artificial authority was leaking out of his voice, replaced by a hollow, creeping dread. "Bureaucracy," Alfred rasped, leaning back slightly, his spine popping in protest. "The worst things in human history aren't done by monsters in the dark, Carter. They're done by accountants in well-lit rooms. That's the ledger for Operation Sandblast. We moved. Cargo. They signed the checks." "Shut up," Carter snapped. He looked up, his eyes darting to his men. The 4 other operators were still holding the perimeter, rifles aimed at the shattered doorway, the windows, the empty kitchen. They couldn't see the file. They didn't know the room had just become radioactive. "You don't want to read the second page, son," Alfred said gently. The tremor in his hand was fading. The adrenaline of the breach had washed out of his system, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. He felt a draft sweeping in from the destroyed front door, chilling the sweat on the back of his neck. "I told you to shut up," Carter hissed. Stepping back from the table, he reached up and keyed the radio on his left shoulder. "Command, this is Entry Team 1. Target is secure. We have..." "We have sensitive materials on site, requesting immediate ETA on the federal handlers." The radio cracked. A burst of static, sharp as a needle, hissed through the speaker. "Copy. Entry 1. Interference. Stand by." The dispatcher's voice was broken, chewed up by sudden, heavy static. Carter frowned. He keyed the mic again. "Command. Repeat. Signal is degrading. ETA on the feds?" Silence. Then a low, oscillating hum filled the earpiece. It wasn't static. It was active jamming. Carter's eyes went wide. He looked at Alfred. Alfred offered a small, sad smile. He picked up his shattered coffee mug, examining a large, jagged piece of ceramic with his thumb. "I told you, Carter. They didn't send you here to arrest me. They sent you here to contain the area." "Perimeter, talk to me," Carter barked into the radio, ignoring Alfred, panic finally bleeding into his tone. "Sniper 1, you have eyes on the road?" The radio remained dead. Just that rhythmic, electronic heartbeat of a jammed frequency. One of the operators by the window, a kid who couldn't be older than 25, shifted his weight, his heavy boots grinding against a piece of drywall. "Cap, I got nothing on comms. Total blackout." "We're in a valley," Carter said, but he didn't believe it. The comms had been crystal clear 2 minutes ago. "You're in a kill box," Alfred corrected. He dropped the piece of broken ceramic. It hit the table with a dull clatter. "You read the page, Carter. You saw the names. Do you really think they're going to let a local SWAT team walk out of here and testify about a black book slush fund that implicates half the Armed Services Committee?" "We are police officers," Carter said, his voice trembling slightly. It was a plea to the universe, an invocation of a badge that suddenly felt like a piece of tin. "They don't hit cops." Alfred let out a dry, rattling cough that tore at his throat. He tasted pennies and old dust. They hit whoever is in the way. "I was a patriot once too. I wore the flag. I did the jobs. And when I figured out what I was actually doing, I spent 40 years looking over my shoulder, waiting for the knife in the dark. You boys?" Alfred looked around the room at the armored men. "You're just the packaging. They're going to burn the house down to get rid of the trash." Crunch. The sound was faint, coming from the tree line about 100 yards past the shattered front door. It wasn't a careless rookie shifting his weight. It was the synchronized, deliberate movement of heavy tires on frozen gravel. The scrub jays didn't go quiet this time. They had already abandoned the woods entirely. The ambient light in the cabin seemed to shift, taking on a bruised blue quality as the morning sun struggled through the heavy canopy of the pines outside. "Positions!" Carter yelled, his instincts finally overriding his denial. "Windows! Door! Cover your sectors!" The SWAT team moved with practiced fluidity. Black armor shifting, lasers cutting through the lingering dust. 2 men stacked by the ruined doorframe, peering through the splintered oak. One took the window overlooking the driveway, his rifle barrel resting on the cracked sill. "I got vehicles," the operator at the window called out, his voice tight, lacking the bravado of the initial breach. 3 black Suburbans, no plates. They're stopping at the edge of the tree line. "Feds?" Carter asked, moving to the wall beside the window, keeping his body out of the fatal funnel. "They ain't wearing windbreakers, Cap," the operator replied. He pulled his eye away from his optic, looking back at Carter. The kid looked sick. "They're wearing plate carriers. Helmets." suppressed rifles. They're fanning out, moving tactical. Carter looked back at Alfred. The old man was still sitting at the table. He hadn't moved to take cover. He was just watching the dust motes dance in a shaft of cold sunlight, piercing the room. "Get on the ground, Hayes," Carter ordered, though there was no heat in it. It was just reflex. "My knees," Alfred reminded him softly. "I think I'll just sit right here." He reached into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt. Instantly, 3 rifles snapped toward him, the laser dots converging on his forehead. Alfred froze, holding his hand perfectly still inside his pocket. "Relax, boys," Alfred murmured. "If I had a gun, I would have used it when you blew my door off. I'm just getting a smoke." Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he pulled out a crumpled pack of unfiltered Pall Malls and a battered brass Zippo. He placed a cigarette between his chapped lips and struck the lighter. The sharp smell of lighter fluid cut through the stench of C4. He took a deep drag, the tip flaring a bright, angry orange, and blew a thin stream of blue smoke toward the ceiling. "You have about 2 minutes," Alfred said, the cigarette bobbing as he spoke. "They're setting up a perimeter. They'll use thermal optics to confirm how many bodies are in the cabin. Then they're going to put incendiary rounds through the walls. White phosphorus, probably. Burns at 5,000 degrees. It'll melt that Kevlar you're wearing right to your skin. Nothing left but ash, and a tragic story about a meth lab explosion that took out a brave tactical team." "Why?" Carter asked, stepping away from the window, moving back toward the table. "Why make the call if you knew they'd do this?" Alfred took another slow drag. The smoke burned his lungs, a familiar, toxic comfort. "Because I'm tired, Captain Carter. I'm 71 years old. I have neuropathy in my feet, arthritis in my spine, and every time I close my eyes, I see the faces of people who trusted me right before I buried them. I wanted to be done, but I couldn't just burn the file. That would be letting them win. I needed to hand it to someone. I needed it to exist in the light, just for a second." Alfred reached out and took the top piece of paper, the ledger with the senator's name. He slid it across the wooden table toward Carter. "Take it," Alfred commanded. His voice wasn't a raspy whisper anymore. For a brief second, it held the steel of the man he used to be, the man who ordered strikes in the dark. Carter looked at the paper. "Fold it up. Put it inside your strike plate," Alfred instructed. "When the shooting starts, you boys break out the back. There's a ravine 50 yards through the brush. It's steep, but it'll give you hard cover from the thermals. Follow the creek south. It hits a state highway in 2 miles. "We're not leaving you," Carter said, his jaw tightening. It was a lie, and they both knew it. "You can't carry me, and I can't run," Alfred said, his tone devoid of self-pity. It was pure arithmetic. "I'm the target. As long as I'm in this chair, their focus is on the cabin. It gives you a window." Thwip, crack. The sound was tiny, almost comical, like a suppressed staple gun. The operator at the window slumped backward, his rifle clattering against the floorboards. He didn't scream. He just hit the ground like a sack of wet cement. A neat, perfectly round hole had appeared in the center of the reinforced glass, surrounded by a spiderweb of cracks. "Sniper, get down!" Carter roared, lunging away from the sightline. The cabin erupted into chaos. The remaining operators dropped to their knees, their heavy breathing amplified in the sudden, claustrophobic terror of the room. The illusion of law enforcement had vanished entirely. They were no longer police. They were prey. Alfred didn't flinch this time. He took a calm, deliberate pull from his cigarette. The fear that had gripped him 20 minutes ago, the animal panic, was gone. The waiting was over. The bill had finally arrived. He looked at Carter, who was crouched on the floor, his eyes darting frantically between his downed man and the shattered door. Take the paper, Carter, Alfred said gently, his voice barely carrying over the sound of a second suppressed round punching through the exterior drywall, showering the kitchen with plaster. Carter crawled forward, his gloved hand trembling. He snatched the ledger sheet off the table. He didn't look at it. He folded it violently, shoving it down the collar of his armor, pressing it flat against his chest plate. It felt like a ticking bomb against his skin. "Back door!" Carter yelled to his surviving men, pointing toward the rear of the cabin. "Move! Move! Cover fire! Then we break for the ravine." The three operators didn't hesitate. Survival instinct overrode their training. They began laying down blind, deafening bursts of automatic fire through the front wall. The deafening roar of the 5.56 rounds momentarily drowning out the clinical, suppressed thwip-thwip of the incoming fire. The air in the cabin turned into a choking fog of drywall dust, splintered pine, and the harsh, metallic stink of cordite. Carter paused at the edge of the kitchen, looking back one last time. Alfred Hayes was still sitting at the table. He had closed the manila folder. He rested his hands on top of it, the cigarette burning down toward his knuckles, a long column of gray ash defying gravity. The old veteran wasn't looking at the door, or the men shooting, or the bullets tearing his home apart. He was looking out the broken window at the Douglas firs, watching the wind push the heavy branches against the pale morning sky. He looked completely at peace. "Go, kid," Alfred said, though the gunfire drowned out the words. Carter only read his lips. Carter turned and threw his shoulder into the rear door, breaking out into the freezing, biting air of the woods, running toward the ravine, carrying a piece of the dark taped to his chest.